All right, gang. So you know well at this point in time that I don't ever have questions prepared for my guests. I like to keep it conversational in tone. And today, that thesis will pay off because I could say to our guest, that's a lovely sweater you have on. And he'd be like, well, the interesting thing about sweaters is that in ancient Egypt, when they were weaving, and I love that about our guest today. I'm sitting down with none other than Ben Hadley. He is the CEO and founder at Autogenous, has had quite the history in automotive, working for some very influential companies in our space. Ben, thanks so much for joining me on the Dealer Playbook podcast.
I'm pumped to be here.
So I got to know you through the Asodu boys, the bearded band of brothers. And so, I'd followed you from afar on LinkedIn, read some of your posts, really enjoyed your narrative on, just different things, not even necessarily automotive. Like I see you've got some narrative about Twitter and everything going on. And I love your perspective. Like the fact that you can easily hop onto a platform and just say, hey, a car dealer owns one of the top 10 most influential social media platforms now. Like nobody thinks about it from that angle, and so I always appreciate that. Have you always thought deeply or differently about things? Like, is that something that happened or developed more as an adult, or have you always noticed that about yourself as you've grown up?
I quite honestly just started noticing it because of a comment you made on the intro on the Asodu Collabs podcast that turned into a thing that I'll do called Cloud Thoughts. So much so that now I'm stopping myself. I was downstairs making some coffee, and it dawned on me. This is a classic. It dawned on me, like, is it faster to heat something up or to cool it down? And and initially you're like, well, that's just a bad question because, depends on what things you're using to heat it up and to cool it down. So I noticed that my coffee always sort of like the pot that I use to make it seems to cool down really fast. Anyways, so at first I was like, that's just a bad question. And then it led me to think about like, what are the qualities of a good question? And, I think that's probably one of the things I contemplate the most right now, which is like, are you asking good questions? Because it's so easy. My mind will typically like connect dots and you were joking about it. You were like, Ben's probably out there somewhere, like looking at his seatbelt, wondering why clouds formed. And that's like not that far out, from the truth. But at the same time, it's almost too easy for my brain to like draw up some sort of pattern that might not even exist.
Right.
And so then I have to like go back and say, whoa, are you even asking? Is that even a good question? By the way, The answer is, it is faster, technically by a very small margin, to heat things up.
Though it does beg to suggest, though, that others have had the same question, because I would imagine questions like that led to the thermal cups that all of it, like the Stanley cups that are a big fad right now, and the insulated cups. Like people were like, well, how do we just slow it down even further?
Right.
So it led to innovation. So and I think that's the thing that I think is really interesting, though I think it makes for great comedy, and I don't want to invite people into the dark parts of my brain because some weird stuff happens there. But it is true, and I think there is a place for that, and it's needed, especially in this industry. Somebody to advocate for, are we asking the right question after having followed a wormhole that brought them to that place? Because I think, and I'd love your thought on this. I mean, I feel like we've just taken so much at face value in our industry for so long that now we're trying to kind of pick up the pieces. What's your take?
Yeah. Well, in this industry in particular, which is near and dear to my heart. I mean, I have my relatives own dealerships. This is all I've ever really done is be an auto. But I get a perspective from both the dealership side and then on the vendor side. And on the vendor side, I think you are more surrounded by the outside software companies that sort of, and the VCs and the investors, and all of those guys are going to influence a certain perspective on how things should change,
right?
On those dots. But then there's the reality of the dealership itself, which in a lot of ways, maybe there's that dot, but they can't exit to the dot. And what I mean by that is that, like, okay, I'm going to pick on DMSs, for example. Could you really operate a dealership without one?
I mean, yeah, right? You could. It would be difficult.
It would be really hard, right?
Yeah.
And then, up until recently, there's really only been two main players. So even like the amount of places you could exit to if you've adopted one of those players, super tough, right? It's like, oh, I can go from this guy to that guy, basically.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And, as you're thinking through innovation, it's like exit to me, the ability to say, nope, I'm leaving that, going over here to make this dot connect, is where innovation really happens. And when you rob people of the ability to do that, you rob people of the ability, you can show them that dot, but they're not allowed to draw the line to it.
Right.
Yeah. So, in my head, it's always been about giving the dealership more exits and more opportunity or more optionality. And I think in today's world, the dealers are, there's a good handful of dealers that are like going to push the envelope regardless. But the vast majority of dealers, I think, have wanted to connect some other dot, try something new. But like whether it's the OEM mandates, whether it's Shift Digital, whether it's the limited options just in general, time and time again, you're going to be told no. And I think it's hard to have the wherewithal to like withstand constantly getting, oh, we can't connect that dot. Oh, we can't connect that dot. Right. That's like really tough.
Yeah.
To be doing that for 30 years and be told, no, you're just not allowed to do that.
Right.
Over and over and over again.
Right.
Yeah.
That is like, so for us, like in my company, we have our tech development side of things. And I feel like that has kind of also summed up my career, because there's this weird thing that happens when you work with developers, software developers in particular, where there's so many of them that want and need work, but then their entire existence, once they have the work, is to find ways to not do the work. Like it's this weird, like, oh, that would take so long, and that would be really like you're always battling this, like, oh, but then there's this thing that you need to think through, and it's like, it's like, do you want to do it or not? Is it a good idea? And so I find, like in my career, it's been a fun challenge where you're like, okay, you're constantly, to your point, I feel like I've constantly had to find the next most creative way to weave in and out of that, and early on, it annoyed me so much. I'd be like, just do the thing.
Just please.
Now I'm like, I've actually found pleasure in being like, okay, how do I push my mind to its limit to find that creative alternative? And I think, there are people like Patrick Abad and like several salespeople, obviously, that have found ways that work for them to weave in and out of, you know, I don't know, the regulatory limitations and things of that nature. And so I'm curious how you see that. Is it like we said about the DMS? It would be difficult to run without a DMS. Not impossible, but difficult. But inside of this ecosystem that we've built for ourselves, essentially, are you seeing creative paths that can lead people to getting ahead despite perhaps some of those limitations?
Oh, yeah, don't get me wrong. I think it is a lot harder to create art when someone just says, "Here's a blank sheet of paper," because you're like, well, do you want me to paint? Do you want me to use these colors? Like, it's like so overwhelming. All you have is a blank piece of paper. But if I said, hey, create art using colored pencils and these 3 colors, it becomes tremendously easier because you have boundary.
Right.
And I think creativity only happens within boundary. And so, you know, in some ways, like I was just saying, it's like there's a ton of boundaries in automotive. But that is also why I think there's creative minds like Patrick Abad that exist, that are like thriving, because they don't look at that as necessarily as a downside. They're like, oh, that's awesome. Like, you've given me these 3 colors. That's where I'm going to perform. So no, I mean, that's actually one of the things I love about this industry is finding the needle or threading the needle, you know? And that's one of the most fun things you can possibly do, I think, is finding a solution to something that seems totally unsolvable.
Yeah, I love that. Switching gears a little bit, your LinkedIn profile headline states that you are a digital retail nerd.
Yeah.
What is a digital retail nerd, and how did you arrive at such level of nerdiness?
I've been there since the very beginning, I think.
Okay.
There's a small independent dealership in Utah that the first day Carvana ever launched, they stopped by the booth when I was over at dealer.com. They stopped by our booth and they were like, hey, like, what's going on? And I'm supposed to be pitching dealer.com stuff. And I was like, screw all that. Check this out. There's these guys called Carvana, and they're making this whole buy from home thing. You should look at that. And it was so cool because years later, this is like 4 or 5 years later after that moment, they found me at an NADA floor and they were like, hey, we made it ourselves. We made a sort of Utah Carvana competitor. And if I remember the name, I'll send it to you for the show notes. But, you know, so like one of the things I've always noticed is that it's not until sort of a third party comes along that a dealer decides to innovate. And it's unfortunate, but this is sort of the pattern. It's like in 1998, Edmunds, KBB, AutoTrader, they all existed.
Right.
And so did dealer.com, but hardly anybody wanted a dealer.com website. In 2004, I think it was, DealerTrack purchased this new vendor that had come on and said, online credit apps is like going to be a thing, right? In 2000, I think it was like 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there, you have these like business plans that come out. And one's for a company called TrueCar. The other one's for a company called Car Gurus. They literally just go to investors and they say, we're going to copy exactly what KBB and AutoTrader and Cars.com did. But we think the consumer wants price transparency. So we're just going to reveal a little bit more. Oh, that's a great price. You know, that's all we're going to do, really,
right.
Is change that.
Right.
And, you know, 2012, maybe 11-ish, Carvana comes out. Simultaneously, Cox Auto, or maybe it was still DealerTrack at the time, they came out with what was like payment driver, finance driver, and some other vehicle driver or something like that. And it was really this attempt at digital retailing. And every single time you had those sort of moments, most of the dealerships were like, nah, F that noise. I actually remember when I first started pitching dealership websites in like 2009, there was a good portion of dealers that would say, well, I don't want a website per se. I just want a web page. Like, just put my address on the page.
Yep.
No, like, don't put cars, because if you put cars, then they're not going to come in and see them.
Right.
You know?
Uh-huh.
And you're like, no. People want cars and pictures and stuff on the website. So what's like the through line there? Well, there's part of it, which is like, what the hell is digital retailing? It's been this evolution from sort of 1998 of just showing the car to the eventual conclusion of like, oh no, like some people do really want to just purchase this thing.
Right.
Then there's the other flip of it, which is, so you asked the question, like, how do you become a digital retailing nerd? I can't point to one particular event, because, really this has been the inevitability of all of this. It's like, at one point in 2003, we had this thing in a CRM that said internet lead. Today, we still have this thing called internet lead. Why do we still have this thing called internet lead? They're all internet leads,
Right.
And it's this sort of like woebegone term that's still included in today's present. And I think digital retailing is going to be one of those woebegone terms that still exists in today's present. We just needed a way to encompass it. And to product it and brand it and bundle it and package it and make it anew, even though it's really something that started in 1998,
Yeah. There's this piece, you said something that triggered the thought in me, which is when websites first came out, the worry was, oh no, then nobody's going to come to our lot. And your reassurance on the back end of that is like, no, people want to see this first. And then that's actually going to compel or encourage them to come to the lot. Now we're seeing this narrative of like, technology is just going to kill all of the human jobs. So as someone that can, where you understand technology and you consult and advise on tech startups, how do you marry this? Are we going full circle? Is that are you seeing that as a similar sentiment as to when websites came out and people thought, no, like, is there room for human? I guess what I'm trying, my ulterior motive is like to get the perspective of someone who understands technology to perhaps give some assurances to the living, breathing humans that no, technology is not going to completely destroy your.
So, look, I think I can give you both sides. The first side, which is where my preferences are, would be like going back to that timeline of events from 1998 to today. All that's really happening is internal for the dealer's eyes only data is just, like an onion, is just getting more and more stripped away and more transparent to the customer. Mm-hmm. That's all, right? It's like started with photos of vehicle, then it became price of car, then it became price comparative to others, so on and so forth. And today, the people that are really, kicking ass out there are, they've already done all of that. They've been super transparent, to that degree. And now it's becoming, let's be transparent with our values, right? What do we stand for? And that really creates a brand. Transparent in the salespeople themselves. So like, what's our culture? And so technology really can't replace any of those things, right? Like there is a certain craving that people have. I was writing about this a little while ago. Actually, I wrote a little bit about it today, which is like digital retailing had its best possible years in the start of COVID. I mean, if you asked, hey, digital retailing company or Amazon or Shopify, ideally, like what would you love to happen so your product is forced to grow? And they would say, how about the government gives everybody some money to experiment with?
I saw this, yes.
Shuts down all of the other local businesses.
Right.
So that you have to go online to order things. And what was the third? Free money, shut down everybody else. I don't know. Check my LinkedIn for the third. Either way, right? We had a perfect circumstance for that growth.
Right.
Amazon just laid off 11,000 people. Shopify laid off an insane amount of people a few months ago. What you captured is like, this is the best that digital retailing could ever really do. This is the best that growth numbers, e-commerce could ever do, because you gave the perfect environmental conditions.
Right.
Unfortunately, people made the mistake of kind of like using that to forecast out and hire and whatever, as if that was going to last forever. But I think the other piece of this is that like habits are very real. Like the consumers want and need to do what they did before is something that, we're all kind of trying to fight and change. But the other lesson, I think, is that there's always going to be a reversion to the mean. So what you see is that you like, even in my own life where I work from home, I love the serendipity of going to a coffee shop and running into someone. Oh my God, we haven't seen each other, right? Mm-hmm. Or going to a Target and like, oh, hey,
Right.
And the internet really robs you of all of that. And so, in some ways, I think there's pent up sort of demand to be in a showroom, to talk to a human, to like shake a hand,
right,
look at a person in the eyes. And I think that's actually going to be something we appreciate more and more because we were finally robbed of it. Mm-hmm. Right. So we forgot how important it was. And so I think in the long term, technology preference would be technology doesn't replace humans. It just supplements them and makes them, smarter, faster, better at connecting, deeper connecting.
Right.
Now, okay. Let me give you the like alternative argument though.
Sure.
Right. The first places we created transparency wasn't in brand and wasn't in culture and wasn't in what we're finally doing today. The first things we did was in price. And in vehicle, both of which basically commoditize what we do. And there's like the age old adage, it's like, if you talk about price and that's all your value is, don't be surprised if the consumer comes in and negotiates, right? Because you've just basically told them that's all you got.
Right.
And that's all we did for like a really long period of time. Great price, fair price, whatever. And so when you commoditize your product, you're also creating a second order effect of commoditizing the customer. And that is like the perfect sort of storm of creating, hey, if customers are basically just steel in cars are just basically the same, like reconfigured steel, these are just commodities, then yeah, it's going to become easier and easier for technology to understand commodity, to trade those. And yeah, and then you're basically creating the foundation for technology to replace human. And so in my point of view, we just need to double down on human, right? And double down on technology that's designed for the end user and not the consumer. So the other through line that you would see through all this tech enablement and innovation over the last, I'd say 10 years, decade, is that almost all of those products, they were designed for the consumer that's buying the car. They weren't really designed for, the BDC person, the marketing person, the general manager. Those guys were sort of this like alternative, like, oh yeah, by the way, here's a dashboard. You can log in and look at a report.
Right.
We weren't the primary person. And so I imagine a future that we need to pivot to, which is sort of like Iron Man Jarvis suit, where, Jarvis really makes Iron Man better, but he's not good on his own. You still need Tony Stark sitting in the helmet, pushing the buttons, saying the commands, doing the things.
Yeah, I love that analogy. I was listening to, or watching rather, a snippet with, this tech YouTuber, Marques Brownlee. I don't know.
Oh, dude, I love it.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, we'll link to him in the show notes if you're not familiar. But this guy's built a massive presence basically doing tech reviews. He was talking about something similar to this. So, and it had to do with Meta's entire double, triple, quadruple down on metaverse and where they're headed there, and basically pivoting the entire ship to go to this, alternate reality type thing. And he described kind of what you're saying here, where he's like, on the one hand, there's some really cool things that he's seen. For example, the ability to put the goggles on and see your work environment in front of you, but then all of a sudden be able to have 2 extra computer monitors that you can interact with. And, as if you had 3 computer monitors on your desk, but you don't actually. So things that can augment and, to your point, supplement, I can see a benefit in. It's like, oh, sweet. I don't have to actually have my whole desk taken up by more devices, more hardware. I can actually supplement that by just throwing on the goggles. But then also, to your point, there's this very real, but once those goggles are on, I isolate myself from the rest of my surroundings. Like,
yeah, no, golly. Okay. So yeah, I think dude, we're going to get ready for a cloud spot here. So I think most, enormous tech companies, guys that go way past $1 billion, they take advantage of contradiction. So I think contradiction is actually the best thing in the world. It's the most human thing. And it will be probably really important in the future to determine if AI can even really exist, is how AIs wrangle with contradiction. A couple things I would point out. One is Mr. Beast, Marques Brownlee. AI can't replace them because you get to know them so well, so intimately. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's just another onion layer. Dealers should do the same. Salespeople at dealerships should do the same. They should have a brand. And I think micro branding at the dealership level, or I think what people are calling tier 4 branding, which I really like, is going to be super important. Okay. But now back to the tech thing. So if you can capitalize on both sides of a contradiction, you're just gonna win. Okay. So in the 80s, think about the mall. All right. Just your regular retail mall. And the contradiction being that people really want to be unique, right? But they also want to belong. And those two don't really fit great with each other. Right? It's like, oh, I'm unique. Nobody else listens to this music. Oh, crap. Everybody does. So I should listen to some other music. Or more poignantly, I'm a teenager and I want to be unique. So you know what? I'm going to be a goth. I'm going to go to Hot Topic with all the other goths. Right? Or no, I'm going to be a skater and I'm going to go PacSun with all the other skaters. Right? So it's like this moment of uniqueness. And then as soon as you walk into the room or the store and you see everybody else just like you, right? It's actually something I think dealers should start thinking more about is, Tesla, for example. There's a certain snootiness or something There's a certain thing about Tesla buyers, not snootiness. Sorry. I have a Tesla, so I can say this. But there is a certain thing about Tesla buyers that like you could stick them all into a room and they probably would find common ground, where it's harder to do with most of your other brands that try to go very wide. Okay, that's one. For Meta somehow figured out how to disconnect all of us and also connect all of us, right? So it's like, hey, you can connect with anybody in the world now. The only caveat is you have to disconnect with everything that's near you. So if you ever find yourself like on a couch next to your wife or spouse, and one of you has a phone in front of your face and you're checking through Instagram or Facebook or whatever, you're disconnecting locally so that you can connect, with someone random outside. And so the actual like metaverse is like taking that thought process to the extreme. It's like, hey, forget literally everything around you. I always think that's really creepy that, in probably the 1920s, you had movie screens maybe 35 feet away from you. And then in the 1950s, you get this TV screen, it's 10 feet away from you. And then the 1990s, you get a computer screen, it's now 2 feet away from you. And then you get this phone and it's like 1 foot away from you. Right. So there's this natural progression of screen just getting closer to face that I also think is a trend line. But, and so I think that's actually, I think Zuckerberg is like way over his skis a little bit on this one. I think, again, back to the Amazon Shopify reversion to the mean thing. I don't think we're at a time where people are like, what I really need is less human interaction. I think there's still this giant craving for like, I kind of enjoyed flying on a plane recently just because I was like, hey, this person I could talk to,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You enjoy, it could use it could use fewer odors.
Yeah.
But aside from that, and fewer people taking their shoes off.
Right. It's like you can't smell my coffee breath right now.
Yeah, that's right. But like in the same token, I thought that was really interesting. While, in Canada, we were locked down.
Yeah.
And, kids were all doing the online school and Zoom classes. And I thought it was really interesting that just a few months earlier, you have, to your point, teens with screens like this, nonstop, Instagram, this and that. And with just a few months of overload to their perception, they were like, I never want to look at a computer ever again. Totally. Like, I'm so sick of looking. I want to be out with my friends. I want to see people. I somehow really want to go to the family reunion all of a sudden. Like there was so like this innate human desire to have human to human interaction, which I think is really interesting, especially how we're moving, but also validates what you've been saying as a thread through this conversation, Ben, which is the need for dealers to double down on human. The brand, the micro brand or tier 4 brand, like you're talking about, I think is so valuable and going to continue to be valuable as we move into 2023 and beyond. One last question, obviously, to turn back to you. How can those listening or watching get in touch with you, follow you, learn more about you?
I think mostly hit me on LinkedIn. It's probably the fastest way. I'm usually on there. If there's dealers listening that are super progressive and want to join the Autogenous community, www.autogenius.io is where you can apply. And it's basically, I think we're at about 1,000 rooftops now.
Wow.
Just super private, on purpose, like an insane knowledge base where some of the best marketers in the industry can basically go to either ask questions or answer questions. And really the thought was, can we design automotive? Can we architect it better if collectively the end user has a larger voice? And so that's our big goal is, one of the things that we really want right now is more open APIs, as an example. And we're already working with some companies to basically say, hey, look, like this is a demand for this group of people. So if you want to join the fight, that's a good place to hang out with me too.
Awesome. Ben Hadley, thanks so much for joining me on the Dealer Playbook podcast.
Thanks for having me.